starting to record. There we go. Okay. So yeah, like I said, I'll just count us in and introduce you, and you can kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and stuff. And so if you hear any rustling around, it's probably the baby or my wife in the background. But
don't put them on the same page.
Yeah. All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome everybody to the first episode we've done in a few months of St. Joseph's Workshop podcast. This is Alan and Andrew coming to you tonight. Jason and Mark couldn't join us. But we want to, I'm really excited about this episode because it's actually been kind of in the works now since we first talked to Stephen in November. And we think it's a really important kind of underappreciated subject. The idea of recognizing when a boy becomes a man in our culture today, and the rite of passage of, just acknowledging when he reaches manhood. And so I don't want to, jump ahead, but Steve, this is Stephen Arms, the author of the book Milestone to Manhood, and it's already published, correct, Steve? For some reason, I thought it wasn't published yet, and I was like gonna say it was the forthcoming book, but I think it's already out, right? I think I saw it on Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. The book is out. It's in print and ready to order. And
you co-authored it with your father, which is also something I didn't realize at first, which I think is a very cool kind of experience for a father and a son. So anyway, you want to tell us more about yourself and just kind of maybe how you came up with this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Stephen Arms. I was born and raised in California. I spent the first 25 years of my life there until I met my beautiful wife-to-be. We actually met on Catholic Match, and she's from Portland, Oregon area. So I made the move up to Oregon, and we were married in 2018. And then in 2019, we welcomed our first child into the world, and now we have 2 kids. Our daughter is 3 years old, and we have a 1-year-old boy. And then we're actually expecting our 3rd child on the way here soon too. So God has blessed us with a family right off the bat, which is what we were both hoping for. So I consider myself to be a lucky man for sure. But what I'm here to talk to you guys about today is a family tradition that my family has. When a boy or a girl turns 13, our family would give them what's called a rite of passage. And a rite of passage is essentially a moment that a boy or a girl can look back on in their life and know that was the moment that I became a man. And when we look at other cultures from around the world, we see these examples of rites of passage, these coming of age ceremonies. The most famous is probably the Jewish bar mitzvah, which is the ceremony in the Jewish faith where a boy achieves the status of man. Another example would be in Australia, the Aboriginal society, they have what's called a walkabout, where a boy in the tribe is sent off into the wilderness for 3 to 6 months at a time to survive totally on his own. And when he comes back from that challenge, he's no longer considered to be a boy, but he's considered to be a man, and he's eligible for marriage. Modern Western society, our culture today, doesn't really have an equivalent coming of age event. And I think that's one reason why we are failing to develop men who are truly virtuously masculine, right? We're failing to develop manly men. And one reason that we think that's occurring is because most men today have never been told by another man that you are a man, that manhood has already begun, and that manhood probably began a long time ago for you. Instead, what we see men who are never really emotionally grow up, and they extend their adolescence into their 20s or their 30s. They live with mom and dad. They don't want to get a job. They just essentially want to continue their adolescence as long as possible. So What we are sharing with this book, Milestone to Manhood, is this family tradition to help other fathers bestow the title of man upon their sons when a boy turns 13.
I think
That's
terrific.
yeah,
That's
it
great.
really is. I mean, the more I've like thought about this, the more I realized how important it is, and the fact that we've lacked that in our culture for decades, if not centuries, has played such a central role in, I think, kind of the way the world is now. Like you were saying.
I wonder. So, what, Steve? What did your uh, passage to manhood in your family consist of?
Yeah, so my rite of passage weekend, for one, it wasn't just my dad, but it was all the men in my family who I looked up to. So my rite of passage included my dad, my grandfather, and two of my uncles. And the thinking behind that is, around the age of 13, boys and girls, as we're growing, we want to spread our wings. We want to get more independence, right? So there can be this friction between father and son at the age of 13. And the boy doesn't necessarily want to listen to what dad is saying. But by enlisting the help of other men who the boy looks up to, that helps to break through to the boy in a way that he might actually listen. It could be one of the men might give a piece of advice to the boy that dad has been saying for the last 6 months, but just hearing it come out of the voice of a man who's not his father, the boy finally listens. But Alan, to answer your question, so my rite of passage weekend, it's actually made up of 7 different rituals, 7 different ceremonies. When we look at other examples of rites of passage, whether it's the Jewish bar mitzvah or even a high school graduation ceremony, that's a rite of passage in itself, right? High school is ending and college or your working career is about to begin. So we have this ceremony to help you make the transition. And in all of those rite of passages, we see these ceremonies that give the ritual, give the rite of passage meaning, right? We knew that, if you took a group of guys and put us away in a cabin in the woods for a weekend, we would most likely just spend the whole time fishing. But by having these sharing exercises, it helps the men to talk about things that really matter in life and not just stay at the trivial level. So just to list them by name, those 7 different rituals were an entrance ceremony, a discussion of what it means to be a man, a scripture sharing exercise, the gifting of a family heirloom, the gifting of letters to the boy, a ribbon ceremony where each man looks at his positive and negative character traits. And then the final ceremony is the formal bestowing of the title of man. And that's kind of like what the whole weekend has worked up to, where the boy is finally told by his dad or his grandfather, in this family, you are no longer considered to be a boy, but you are officially a man, just like the rest of us.
It's interesting. What I'm picking up on too, and listening to you, is there's a strong focus on extended family, being part of this family and finding one's place in this extended family. And by the essence of being there with your uncles and your grandfather, having that multi-generational and extended family present, and then gifting an heirloom, as if now all of a sudden they're part of this continuity, this tribe. I'm wondering, do you think that that's something that you'll incorporate when you have a son who turns 13, or do you think that that's something that maybe also stands out counterculturally to what's going on in our country, where the oftentimes young people do not live in intergenerational families or around an extended family?
Yeah, I mean, when my son turns 13, I'm definitely going to have a rite of passage for him. I mean, I'm really looking forward to that day, to be honest. I can't wait for that to happen. I'm not really going to change the weekend for him. I'm going to give him the same type of weekend that I had, the same rituals, the same exercises. These were exercises that actually my grandfather came up with. My dad, he started this rite of passage tradition when my older brother was turning 13, when his oldest son was turning 13. But he didn't really know like what would make a weekend meaningful for a boy, like in Australia, they send the kids off into the wilderness for 3 months, right? Like my dad could have done that, but he knew that wouldn't have been helpful for a boy growing up in the early 2000s. It just wouldn't help him make that leap from boy to manhood in the culture that we live in today. So he enlisted the help of my grandfather. My grandfather was a very holy man. He was a very special person. He was very well loved in his community. He had a big family, big Italian Catholic family. And he was just a really special person. And he was very involved in the Cursillo movement and did a lot of Cursillo retreats. So he took some of those exercises that he picked up on from Cursillo retreats and kind of tweaked them to be incorporated into a rite of passage weekend that would help a 13-year-old boy gain his masculine identity and see himself as a man, and form his image of what it means to be a man. That's why, that second ritual there is literally just a discussion where all the men sit down in a circle and they each share, what does it mean to be a man, right? Because inevitably our boys are being formed by the internet, by TV, by their peers at school. They're getting influenced by the culture is telling them what it means to be a man. But the whole idea of this weekend and that discussion of what it means to be a man is to paint a different picture, to say, this is what it means to be a man in our family. And I know for me personally, it was the example of my dad, my grandfather, my uncles, the lives that they were living, and the fact that they sat down and had a discussion with me about what real manhood really is. That really helped me as I entered into my teenage years and into my 20s and thought about how should I behave personally. It helped me to realize, these guys were saying, this is what it means to be a man in our family, and this is the bar that we expect you to hold yourself to now that you are becoming a man yourself.
So you mentioned these retreats that your grandfather was really involved. What would you say they were called?
Cursillo. It's I'm not too sure. I think they were big in the 60s. Kind of like an evangelical Catholic movement. They definitely, are very in touch with the Holy Spirit, and they pray over one another. I did go to a few of my grandfather's men's groups. They would meet once a week and throughout the year. So I got a little taste of what these weekends were like, but it was really just these stories I would hear from my grandfather about how powerful Cursillo was. And yeah, that's the kind of the template that he used to come up with this weekend.
So okay, that's cool. That really kind of informed the development of the rite of passage. I like that. I hadn't heard of that before, but I can appreciate that. I'm a convert from evangelicalism, so I can kind of appreciate that foundation, I guess.
I think the Cursista movement is pretty big in Latin America, and that's probably what brought it to California, is the Latin influence there.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that your grandfather is an Italian American, who I'm presuming is from the Bay Area as well. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
That he got involved in this, and so it's great. But I think too, it's part of a generation of lay movements in the church post Vatican II. Kind of like Communion and Liberation and San Egidio movement, this type of stuff, and kind of an opportunity for lay people to get together and discuss their faith. And a lot of empowerment, quite honestly, has come from that in a great way. And I think, that's been one of the gifts actually of the Second Vatican Council, is we've had a lot of these lay movements that have borne just a lot of fruit. And there's an Italian priest and spiritual writer whose name is on the tip of my tongue, who I can't remember right now, but he writes about this quite a bit. And in fact, one of the things that he says about the Second Vatican Council is that that's one of the brightest lights, was these types of lay movements that have really exploded. And I think in many ways it's true, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you. The ownership that laymen took following Vatican II of developing community in their parishes. I mean, that obviously led to the Curcio movement, which led to this, which I find super impressive. And it sounds like the way you're kind of describing how the weekend goes. First of all, it's an entire weekend. Like,
it's a 2-day trip. It's one night, so
okay,
yeah, it's a weekend.
And I just like the word that comes to mind when you're kind of describing each step that you guys go through is like achievement. So it kind of sounds like, manhood isn't just something that you arrive at, it's something you achieve, because you're talking about the virtues that the person extols. You're talking about like the ribbon ceremony. I like that. I like that a lot. And then the letters, each man is kind of delivering a very personal message to the boy who's becoming a man. So it's kind of like saying congratulations. You mentioned the graduation ceremony. It's like, congratulations, you've grown now to this point. Now here you are now. And I'm just like, I'm processing all this. This is such a good idea. I like it a lot.
You're totally right, Andrew. And I think that is consistent with other rites of passages that we see in other cultures. There's always this element of challenge, right? In the bar mitzvah, the boy has to learn how to speak a whole new language. He has to learn how to read and speak Hebrew. And then he has to read out of the Torah in front of the congregation for the very first time in his life and give a reflection on what he just read in front of everyone. So in the bar mitzvah, his challenge is intellectual and spiritual in nature. And that's something that my dad and my grandfather, when they were making this weekend, that's what they wanted to include as well. They wanted it to be intellectually challenging, spiritually challenging, emotionally challenging, so that the boy could know that he, in a way, has kind of proven to himself that he is a man and that he doesn't have to go into the world and do some of the things that the culture provides, that says, this is, the culture provides certain activities, almost rituals, for our boys to prove themselves as men. And what this rite of passage weekend does is hopefully tries to replace those unhealthy rituals with healthy, productive rituals.
Great.
So do you take the age 13? Do you is that derived from, like you said, the bar mitzvah and the other rites of passages that you're familiar with, or was there like maybe some other reason that influenced that?
So 13, yeah, the bar mitzvah, I think, definitely was one point of reference. Another reason is, already in the boy's mind, he's becoming a teenager. So that's already kind of a milestone birthday for him already. 13 years old, boys are, they're just starting to make that transition physically. I mean, everyone develops at a different age, but 13 in general is that time when your body starts to change. And another reason that they kind of settled on 13 is that, admittedly, calling a 13-year-old is pretty early to tell him that he's a man, right? But it's probably better to initiate a boy into manhood a little bit too early rather than a little bit too late, because by the time someone turns 18, 21 years old, they've probably made some pretty important life decisions at that point without the full support or full access to the other men in their lives. So long story short, I think 13 years old is the ideal age. Now, that being said, if one of your listeners has a son who's 14, 15, 16 years old, I don't think that's too late to have a rite of passage for him at all.
Sure. But that's a really interesting point, though.
And it sounds fitting too to bring to the connection with the bar mitzvah, right? And so they're at 13 and they can finally read the Torah in Hebrew and they become man because they're able to enter into this relationship with God, essentially. And they then take on the burden of carrying that out in some fashion, some noble fashion. And presumably Christ also was bar mitzvah, right? Probably something we don't really think about.
Actually, Alan, I did some research on that because I didn't know. But so the bar mitzvah that we know has only been around for about 500 years. It's a relatively new ritual, relatively new ceremony in the Jewish faith. So it's actually fair to say that Christ did not have a bar mitzvah.
Okay, well then, thank you for sharing that. But it's interesting too. Well, I mean, this is not the scope of the discussion, but what is it then all of a sudden in Judaism, right? Because Judaism is diasporic, and so what is it that all these Jewish communities really came together with the idea that at 13, they needed a bar mitzvah, or today too we have bat mitzvahs and things like that. The priest I was thinking of, the Italian priest, is Carlo Corretto, and in English, the text is, I saw it and I found, the Italian text is Cercato Trovato. And one of the things that struck me about his text is that he says, I found God because I looked for him. People say to me, I have looked for God and I couldn't find him. And he says, how can that be? Right? Because and he quotes scripture about it, which I'm not doing justice to. But he's like, if you look, you'll find, and you've got to go out there and look. And I think that what your tradition seems to do is to look to make men out of their boys. And I think that's what separates your tradition and your family, maybe, from dominant society, which is looking to keep boys as boys and to not only boys, but to keep the young. There's a culture of youth, an exaltation of youth, which is tied in with hedonism, youth like hedonism. And I wonder if this exaltation of hedonism and youth like hedonism is so rooted in our culture today that it's antithetical to the responsibilities and everything that's connotated with being an adult, that the idea is that one should shirk it, right? And so one is no longer just a young person, then they're a young adult, right? And so not just, right, one's not just a man, one's a young man after they're a boy, for example. And I'm not too sure to what degree we need to make that specification, for example, but it's out there quite a bit. I don't know. And so I think that what you're doing and what you're bringing to the world through your text is beautiful, really. And I think it's very helpful. And I think that certainly many readers will benefit from reading through it, not least because it will allow the reader to reflect on their own understanding of the importance of being an adult and the burdens it carries and revisiting how their transition went, I'm sure. And I'm wondering, what you would like to see as a result of this text being released in the world. And I think part of the reason why I wonder that is, yes, there's a walkabout. Yes, there's a bar mitzvah. Yes, there's a quinceanera for women in the Mexican tradition and so on, right? Bat mitzvah. But it seems like in contemporary society, any type of postmodern relativistic rite of passage would be the bachelor party, essentially, right? Is something like a hedonistic bachelor party, if we can imagine such. And that bears, what I can't imagine the if indeed before getting married, a groom fully partakes in some sort of a Hollywoodian bachelorette party or bachelor party, how that in any way would be helpful to the marriage. Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so we can have rites of passage, but then we have to enter into the discussion to the value and the importance of the rites of passage and the right orientation of these rites of passage and what is the passage to and so my question is that, so what would you like as a result of this book being released into the world?
Our goal for this book is really to share our family tradition with other dads so that they can hold one of these rites of passages for their son. This family tradition has been an incredible blessing to our family for me personally, I can say, if it wasn't for my rite of passage weekend, I am not sure that I would be a practicing Catholic today, because in college, I seriously started to doubt my faith and my belief in God. And I was very nervous to talk to my parents and tell them, Mom, Dad, I'm not sure if I believe in God anymore. But it was in my early 20s in college that I remembered back to my rite of passage weekend and how all of the men there said, "You are now a part of a tribe of men, and we love you unconditionally. We have your best interests at heart. So if you ever have questions or come into a rough patch in life, please come to us for advice." And it was those words that were said to me, 8 years earlier, that I remembered. And that gave me the confidence to go back to them and to say, "Dad, Grandpa, I'm not sure if I believe in God. Can you help me out here?" And I think that that's what college can really be, a make or break time for a lot of people in their faith. And I think what's missing is that it can be that sense of trust from one generation to the next. I don't want to disappoint them, but they're the very people that can help you out in that kind of trying time. So that's what my rite of passage gave for me. It was an incredible blessing. And like I said, I'm not sure that I would be a practicing Catholic today if it wasn't for that. And that's why it's so important for me to share this with other families, so that fathers can connect with their sons and sons can learn that their fathers can be trusted and should be trusted. So our goal for the book is simply to help other fathers do this for their boys.
I kind of want to focus in on a couple things. In the book, you describe, kind of visual. I got a really great visual in my mind of your weekend, and you described like going to a cabin, and I was curious. I was like, wondering what kind of significance you think the wilderness might play in the overall, kind of experience of this rite of passage. Because I don't know. Have you ever heard of the book Wild at Heart by John Eldridge?
I've heard of it, by John Eldridge. I've never read it, but I've definitely heard of it.
It's obviously it's not a Catholic work, so I don't know if I would, put my stamp of approval on it or whatever, but it was very popular in the circles that it came from before I converted. And there is this kind of aspect of what he's saying about, how a man has kind of this primal drive to pursue certain things. And he wasn't talking about obviously anything scandalous or whatever, but just that kind of connection with nature and how those things kind of compel a man to move forward in life. And so I'm wondering, if there's any significance in kind of the formula that you're presenting in your book, to like going off, kind of, because like you look at like, tribes that you described that, like the Aboriginal tribe, like you were saying, like they go off into the wilderness and they come back a man. So there's that departure as a boy and that return as a man. Is that important? Is that an important element for what you're proposing?
I think it is. Yeah. I think that in an ideal rite of passage, you go to a place where the boy has never been to before. That physical journeying of going to a new place, it kind of reflects the interior journey that he's making now that he's entering this new chapter in his life. A big part of it is just disconnecting from our technology driven world, right? Where we have all these distractions all the time that it kind of prevents us from thinking about the deep things in life and really reflecting on where is our life going. And so by going out into the wilderness or just going away out of your home, bringing the boy out of his hometown, turning off all electronics, it gives the boy and all the other men there too time to think about, oh, I'm becoming 13. I'm going to become a man here. I'm going to become a teenager. I'm becoming a man, and it gives him time to reflect on in his life and where his life might go. Da Vinci has a quote, I'm going to butcher it, but he was a great artist, and he said something along the lines of, as artists, it's important to step back from your work sometimes because you need to get perspective on the painting that the overall big picture, the painting that you're working on. you can't get that perspective when you're in it working on the details. And that's why stepping back and retreating from the world is important to do from time to time.
I can appreciate that. Yeah, it's amazing how, like, because I've been on a few retreats here or there, like with my old church, and it's really interesting how reflection kicks in kind of a strange environment. But I think it's kind of vital that it be like a peaceful environment, not the chaos of like some major city or something like that. I think that could be kind of disruptive. So you got to go off. You got to, like John the Baptist did, and go off into the wilderness, or like the Desert Fathers.
Absolutely. And I'll temper everything that I just said with the fact that, if that's the one reason that a father can't do a rite of passage for his son because he can't get a new place, out of his city, whether it's financial reasons or another reason, I wouldn't let that hang you up from organizing one of these weekends. I think it's important for dads to help their sons make the transition from boyhood to manhood. Especially, I think it's important for dads to tell their sons, in my eyes, I no longer see you as a boy, but I see you as a man. And I think that's the core element of the weekend, is getting affirmation from the father and from other men in the boy's life. Going off into the wilderness is great. I encourage it, but that shouldn't prevent anyone from holding one of these weekends.
I think that's a really good kind of caveat there. Because it's true. Yeah. I mean, the reality is that not every father can afford to, take his son way off someplace. I mean, ideally, yeah, but yeah, sometimes there's just circumstances that preclude that. But the point is the experience itself.
Right. And it sounds like even having all things being the same, if a father just invited his brothers and father, so the child's uncles and grandparents over the house, and they all had stayed in the house together, while maybe the mother and any other women stayed somewhere else in somebody else's house, right? That would probably accomplish a similar thing. Sure.
So there was another one part that stuck out to me too, was you were talking about your friend Aaron, and the how you would spend weekends kind of doing different construction projects on his house, and suddenly here he is, he's about to leap into marriage and family and all that stuff, and he's kind of questioning his own manhood, and he's asking you, when did you know? And for you, that was kind of an odd thing to ask, because it just like never, I don't know, maybe it didn't occur to you or something, that like a lot of other guys don't have the same experience. So, and that kind of resonated with me, because I didn't. So there were times, that things I wish I had done when I was a boy. Like I tell my wife some story about how I wish my dad taught me to hunt. He learned to hunt from my grandpa, and when I was young, I wanted him to take me to hunt, but my dad never wanted to do that because he had some kind of experience when he was young hunting that really turned him off to it. And he's not like a PETA guy or whatever. He just, he was deer hunting and something happened and kind of, I don't want to say traumatized him, but he didn't want to hunt after that. And so I felt like that's kind of like, at least the part of the world where the part of California where I come from, that was kind of a big ritual unto itself. Your first kill, you get blooded, and it's kind of like a small rite of passage, maybe. So, encountering men, there's got to be so many of us out there who haven't had a proper rite of passage into manhood. And I don't know, like, is there something that can and should be done for us men who are, like me? I'm 35. I never had that, but here I am. I'm married, have kids. I'm working a career, and so it's like I've already got all the other marks of manhood. But it's like, is it worth still seeking out that kind of affirmation of like, yeah, you're a man?
I would say for guys like you, I mean, 35, married, have kids, have a job, clearly, doing your best to pursue the Lord. Like, you are a man, and to be honest, you're not a 13-year-old boy. You don't need a rite of passage weekend. I mean, I know even me, even though I did have a rite of passage weekend, I questioned myself, my own abilities. Can I do this? What, certain challenges in life, especially, Andrew, I know you just had a baby. Your wife just had a baby not too long ago. There's a lot of doubt that comes with that. Can I do this? This is
Yeah,
a
really.
whole adventure in itself. But the reality is, like, you are a man. Manhood began a long time ago for you. You've been a man for a long time. And I think that it's guys like you who your position in life now is, now it's your turn to turn around and help the next generation to make the leap from boyhood to manhood, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're questioning it in yourself, then how much more are our 13-year-old boys questioning it in themselves? So for your
Well said.
nephews, your godsons, your own sons, yourself, now that you know about this rite of passage weekend, now you have some tools to help them make the leap too. It's not your fault you didn't have a rite of passage. Your dad didn't know about it.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing. It's just it wasn't a thing back then. And now that we have something, that's why it was so important for us to share it with the rest of the world, so that guys like you can do it for the boys in your life.
I think that's amazing. Yeah, and I definitely don't like hold that against my dad or anything. I mean, even as a young kid, I understood his reasons. But I'm curious. Do you encounter many people that many guys that who have adopted your family's practice of this rite of passage? Like, do you know anyone personally outside your family?
Yeah, growing up, there were some family friends who my dad were talking to, and when he was telling them about this family tradition, rite of passage at 13 years old, these guys, these other dads they'd always say two things. They'd always say, "Man, I wish my dad did that for me." And then they would say, "I'm definitely going to do this for my son." So yeah, there were other family friends who did similar weekends. I don't think any of them looked exactly the same like ours, but that's okay. It doesn't have to look exactly like ours. So I know that other guys have done weekends like this in their families, and hopefully with this book, many more will do it in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I mean, I feel so convinced that it's a very important thing that needs to happen, especially among Catholics. I think it would have a lot of value, but really for all men. And I was kind of thinking, I was having a conversation with my wife earlier today when I was telling her about this interview coming up and what we were talking about. And it seems like the ritual is important, not just for like validating young men, but also kind of marking a point in their life where they can kind of look back and say, this is the moment when you begin to take responsibility for things. Because it's like, I was noticing, kind of been observing over the years recently that like you have a lot of young men who they continue to enjoy the benefits of childhood, because their parents might support them and they absorb the financial responsibility and they supply all of his needs and stuff. But then they begin also adding the adult benefits of like doing more things outside the home and the freedom to make their own lifestyle choices. But they don't, trade out anything for the adult responsibility too. The paying your bills or paying for food or anything like that. So it's kind of like a having your cake and eating it too thing. And I'm wondering, do you see this ritual as like kind of a moment where it kind of opens up the box, so to speak, to begin saying like, as the kid gets older, it's like, well, you became a man at 13, now you're 16 and you have a car, so obviously here's what it means to be a 16-year-old man and have a car and be responsible for that. I mean, is that kind of an important component? Or
I think it's a huge component. What you just picked up on, that word responsibility, that to me is the mark of a man, right? A man is responsible for his own actions. A boy is not responsible for his own actions. And one way that the rite of passage weekend incorporates that is by giving the boy leadership responsibilities. So for my rite of passage weekend, right, I was the 13-year-old boy, young buck of the group. My grandfather in his 60s, my dad and uncles in their 40s. They turned around and they asked me, "Okay, Steve, you have to pick who's going to cook and who's going to clean during the weekend. You actually have to pick who's going to sleep in each bedroom and who gets each bed, right? So you, by giving the boy some leadership responsibilities, he learns how to make decisions that aren't just going to affect him, but are going to affect other people too. And then definitely after the weekend, that's another way to, after the weekend, a boy's responsibility is increased. So for me and my brothers, 13 years old, we were finally large enough to, push the lawnmower around and mow the lawn. So that became one of our responsibilities. And, I, as a 13-year-old boy, I complained about it. Why do I have to mow the lawn now? But instead of saying something like, because I'm your dad and I told you so, right? That's just like a flex of authority, right? There's no like real meaning behind that. Instead of that, what my dad would say is, well, now that you are a man of this family, you need to take responsibility and learn how to do these things, because one day you're going to be married and have a family and have a house of your own, and you're going to have to mow your own lawn. So it's a good thing for you to learn how to do these things, because this is going to serve you well as you enter into manhood too. So incorporating responsibility is definitely a part of the whole idea of having a rite of passage.
That's well put. I like that.
Terrific.
Alan, did you have any other questions you wanted to toss? Or
I think that we've had a great conversation here. Quite honestly, I look forward to reading the book, and I think it's great to have learned about your family's tradition, and hopefully those who read it will find some inspiration to create and pursue something similar in their own lives.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be on your show, guys.
Thank you.
We're really happy to have you on, and we want to thank everyone for listening. And we'll be including the details of the book and a link to it in the show notes. So if you want to buy it, we encourage you to go track it down and buy a copy, because we think it's a really valuable thing to incorporate into our family life. And Stephen, we want to thank you for coming on, and everybody out there listening. We hope to bring more content out. I know it's been kind of slow going the past few months, but there should be more to come. We'll see as things move forward. And so Stephen, again, thanks for coming on, and maybe we'll connect again in the future for more discussions about this, because obviously it's such a kind of broad-reaching subject. So looking forward to it. Thanks again, and everyone, we just want to thank you and say St. Joseph, pray for us.